I had about 5 minutes of introduction prepared until I heard the last couple hours of conversation where I was trying to bridge the gap between what's going on in the business world and education and why education matters. And the last panel, when the question was asked, what's the most important thing we have to do in the next 12 months? And the answer was, we have to do something with K-12 education. I thought, well, I can scrap the first 5 minutes of introduction. This is clearly a topic that this room has a lot of passion for, and you can see a lot of need for. Even outside of our hats as employers, as was mentioned, I also run an educational organization. We have about 400 employees. About 250 of them are here in the state of Wisconsin. Like you, I very much understand this workforce issue. If I were to lay out our strategic plan and talk about our top 3 strategic objectives, all 3 of them would have something to do around with talent. So I very much understand the need for workforce and the importance of education within that workforce development. But outside of just the workforce as employers, many of us in this room are parents, and we're very concerned about the future for our kids and the education we're providing for them. We just finished another election season. We're stepping back. We recognize that we live in a democracy, and the very foundation of our democracy assumes an educated and virtuous people capable of both producing and electing its own leaders. And so for a variety of reasons, the K-12 education ecosystem is very, very important to all of us in all those different ways. Today, I'm going to stand in front of you, and we know there's a lot of concerns with the K-12 education ecosystem. We're going to touch on some of that, but there's also a lot of reason for hope. Roughly 125 years ago in our country, we went through a similar phase where there were a number of macro factors that were forcing the field of education to go through significant shifts. That same thing is happening today, and we're in the process of moving in a direction, as was mentioned in a previous panelist, where just like lettuce was the example used earlier, parents also want a lot of diversity and a lot of ability to customize their child's education. And so we're going to talk about a lot of the things that are happening underneath, but the macro shift that we see happening and has been happening for a period of time in the United States education ecosystem, and it's also true here in the state of Wisconsin, is that we are moving from what was created 125 years ago as really a mass production batching form of education, where essentially children were batched according to their age and where they lived and received a very similar education, to now there's a lot more customization. We're moving to a new place of mass customization in a matching form of education. We're talking about that macro shift at a national level. From there, we're going to zoom in a little bit, talk about what the implications are here in the state of Wisconsin, and then at the very end, we'll talk about what are the implications for members of WMC, both as individuals and also as an association. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background context. The data that's up in front of you, you probably can't see some of the details, and it's okay. You're going to get the big picture. I was exposed to this data about 25 years ago, and it changed the trajectory of my life. And I think it's going to be very, if you haven't seen this data before, it'd be very eye-opening for you as well. Earlier, it was mentioned by Wade that it feels like we're in the 9th year of having the same conversation. The field of education is in the 40th year of having the same conversation. It's been a long time. Much of what I show up here is 20 to 30 years old. The bottom right-hand graph is a graph looking at the amount of taxpayer dollars going in education over the last 35 years. And the punchline is, after adjusting for inflation, the amount of money being spent in education has doubled over the course of 35 years. Unfortunately, in spite of those incredible investments that taxpayers are making into publicly funded education, the U.S., the top graph is showing, isn't ranking even in the top 20 when it comes to math and reading outcomes. We are number 1, though, for one thing in the world. At least we were back when the data showed in the bottom left-hand corner. What we're number 1 for in the world is being the least efficient system of education in the world. It costs us more dollars per point of learning on global assessments than anywhere else in the world. All of this information, again, is about 20 years old. This isn't new information. And back in the early 1980s, it led a commission to look at what's going on in the U.S. education ecosystem. And unfortunately, the quote that's up there is one that could be written as well today. So back in 1983, kind of the major quote that came out of that report, the report was called "A Nation at Risk." The major quote that was written is, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to oppose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war." So here we are 40 years later having a conversation about education reform. A lot has changed, though, in those last 40 years. We haven't sat still. If you go back 40 years ago, there were roughly 41 million children in the traditional public system of education, school districts. Back then, there weren't charter schools. There wasn't much discussion about school choice. It was just a very beginning conversation here in the state of Wisconsin. Homeschooling really wasn't a thing. In fact, it was illegal in many states to homeschool your own children. And the new emerging form of microschools wasn't a thing back then either. So much has changed. So we had about 41 million children that were in traditional public schools. We had about 5 million children who were in privately funded private schools. That's where we were about 30 years ago. What I want to talk about next is what is pushing on the field of education to change. So since then, there are these macro factors, like we had 125 years ago, that are beyond the field of education that are forcing the field of education to move. And it's really important to understand what are the factors that are pushing on the field of education to make a change, to help predict, are the things that we see changing today in education going to continue, or are we seeing the end of the changes in education? So I'm going to start with what was mentioned earlier today, and I love the example of the lettuce, and I'm sure in all of your businesses you're seeing similar trends. And that is that there is this great desire by the consumer of today to have significant opportunity for the personalization of all products. And education is not immune to this. So we are seeing this huge push to move away from just the mass production, sort of similar model of education for all kids, which was a model that essentially bats children, as I mentioned earlier, according to their age and where they lived, to something that gives much more customization. In this new form of learning, the learning exchange isn't changing. We're still seeing that the learning exchange, the core learning exchange, exists between the educator, the teacher in the room, the resources, and the kids, but the role of the teacher and the role of the resources is shifting. You can see the significant shifts in this consumer demand in this graph that is up here. In 2021, there was a survey that asked parents on the very bottom, where do your children go to school today? 83% of the people said, my child goes to a local district school. But only about 40% of the people said that was their school of choice. The place where there's growing demand is in private schools. 8% of the family said, my child today goes to a private school, but 35% said that's my first choice. Similarly, in charter schooling, 6% said my child goes to a charter school, but 14% said that was my first choice. And in homeschooling, roughly 3% said their children goes to a homeschool, 13% said that was their first choice. This is a macro factor driving shifts in the U.S. education marketplace. This is very current data. There was a similar survey that was done 6 years before that, pre-COVID in 2015. The data only changed by about 1% over the course of 6 years. What this means is that in the marketplace, in the U.S. marketplace, out of roughly 56 million families today, children today, roughly 45% of them, representing a demand of 25 million children, say, I'm not in my first choice for the form of education I have for my kids. That's putting massive, massive pressure on the marketplace to do something different. And we're going to see that come out in some slides later. A second major disruptor that's happening in the field of education is teacher shortages. We were talking a lot about workforce shortages. As I mentioned, education is not immune to this. In education, if you look at schools of education, sort of the beginning of the pipeline of the workforce, you see that there is massive decline in schools of education all across our country. So if you looked at how many students or how many teachers are coming into the pipeline for education, that number has shrunk dramatically over the last decade. I didn't put these slides on here, but if we looked at the back end of the pipeline, which is the retirements of teachers, you would find out that retirement rates have grown. And if I looked inside the pipeline for teachers, you would find that the average tenure of teachers is shrinking. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at the front of the pipeline, the back end of the pipeline, or the middle of the pipeline. There's less water coming in, there's more water going out, and there's more leaking in the middle of the pipeline. It's a disaster when it comes to teacher shortages. And that disaster is greatest where the need is the greatest, and that is in urban schools. There was a recent study done where they asked urban schools if they had a teacher shortage. 75% of them said yes, and schools collectively, about 44% of them said teacher shortage is one of their biggest concerns. Now, why do I mention this as a factor that's driving the change of education? If we were a restaurant business and we were trying to serve food to our customers, essentially teachers are our chefs. The teachers are the ones who are in the back room making the food for the customers. If all of a sudden you have customers waiting for food but there's no chef in the kitchen, it's going to cause a change to an industry. That's what's happening in the field of education. There simply are not enough teachers to fill the classrooms. And it's forcing us to have to think differently about how are we going to educate children when there's not enough teachers literally to fill the number of classrooms that we have. We can all try to do everything we can to make our schools the most attractive place for teachers to come, but the math doesn't work. If we've got 10 classrooms to fill and only 6 teachers, there's an issue. And it's driving changes in the field of education. It's both leading to some of the decreased quality that we see, but it's also forcing innovation, I think, in some really promising and positive ways. A third factor that is causing a shift in the field of education has to do with increased fragmentation of our population. So people aren't choosing schools anymore just because of what they're trying to learn in mathematics or reading and writing. There's a lot of other things going on in schools today, whether it's health issues, social things being taught. Parents are starting to look at their schools more holistically than just are my children learning math and reading. And whereas in the past they might have been okay if the education they were obtaining was maybe mediocre, that was okay with them. As you start to make decisions about, well, does my child have to wear a mask or not? Does my child have to be vaccinated or not? Are there certain social things being taught in my schools that I'm either on board with or not on board with as a parent? There's just a lot more decision criteria that parents are using to decide what's the right option for their children. As that set of decision criteria grows, and it's very, very important to parents, again, it's causing more and more and more desire for the mass customization, personalization of finding the right niche in the right educational setting for children. That's having a huge impact on changing education. And then finally, what's happening in the workforce, what's happening in career pathways is also changing. There's a lot more flexibility nowadays in where people work and how they work and when they work. And that flexibility is something that you're seeing in your workforce, they desire, but they also want it in the education for their kids. If they have significant flexibility in where they work and the one thing holding them down from the type of flexible lifestyle they desire is their child's education, they're looking for more flexibility in where and when their children learn. In addition, there are more families now who have at least one member of their household working from home. Whereas in the past, one of the needs for formal K-12 education, especially for younger children, was there had to be a place for children to go during the day while either a mom or a dad or both were at work. Nowadays, there's more and more parents who are home, and that creates new capacity and new opportunity that children could be learning from home. So it's shifting dramatically the opportunities and the capacity for where children can learn and when children can learn. And I put on the very bottom there, everything I have said so far was existing before COVID. One of the questions I get quite a bit is, was COVID sort of this short-term phase, and now that we're hopefully through COVID, are we going to go back to the way things were? And what I say to people is when you look at the macro trends that were forcing the field of education to change before 2019, before 2020, those macro trends all predate COVID. They were all there. What happened was that COVID really accelerated the impact of all of these factors. And what I say to people is I feel like we advanced 10 years in terms of those pressures over the course of about 18 months. So I don't believe we're going back. I think we simply jumped forward about a decade in the power of these forces, and it's forcing the field to continue to move in that direction. So to me, COVID has been really an accelerator as opposed to a change of trajectory. So with those things causing the field of education to change, a logical question is, so where is it going, and is this a good or bad thing as it relates to workforce development? So what are these macro forces causing to happen? What are the emerging breakthroughs and what are the emerging trends? First thing I want to talk about is really not just educational technology, but a whole new set of educational resources that are exploding and that are creating incredible opportunity for us to radically transform and improve education. I am going to touch on educational technology as just an example of the types of emerging resources that are exploding in the marketplace today and are making possible totally new forms of education. So we just go to educational technology to begin with. Sitting on top of a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure of technology generally, not specific just to the field of education, you've seen over the last decade this massive explosion in investments in educational technology. If you go back to 2010, which is on the far left-hand side of that graph, globally there's about $0.5 billion per year being invested in educational technology. Fast forward to 2020, 2021, that number is now over 21 billion. There is an enormous amount of energy going on into educational technology to create all kinds of new tools and instruments that are useful for learning. But this, again, is just one example of the explosion of the resources that are being created. If I were to show you a graph of the different forms of tutoring and wraparound tutoring and teaching services, you would see a similar graph. If I would show you summer camps and other activities and experiences that are being wrapped around education, you would see a similar graph. If I would show you a graph of all of the clubs, think of your sports and clubs and fine arts programs, a similar graph. And if I were to show you an example of online education, you'd see a similar graph. So there's this explosion now of what I like to call unbundled, customizable educational resources that now exist in the marketplace that weren't there 10 years ago. The second emerging thing that's happening as people are demanding customized education is there's new forms of schooling that are really beginning to explode. I'm going to touch on homeschooling and microschooling a little bit because they're the best example of what it looks like to really hyper-personalize and customize a child's education. So talk about Mike's, I think we kind of have a sense of what homeschooling is. A parent is the teacher and they're doing school within their own home. There's a wide variety of what homeschooling could look like, from fully online education where the education's being brought in to where the parent is really the primary teacher. So there's a wide range there. But with microschooling, I'm not just talking about kind of a traditional private small school. I'm talking about the integration of a smaller school, but that is built on significantly massed resources. So when I talked about the explosion of educational resources just a minute ago, as you bring those educational resources into a place, a small setting, where the parent is not the teacher, a multi-aged classroom, and you integrate those resources into that learning environment where instead of the teacher or the walls of the setting being the boundaries of learning, that entire landscape of learning opportunities has been opened up to kids. That's the microschooling economy that's starting to explode, and we're going to talk about the growth of that here in just a second. Why are these things growing? When you look at what's driving the changes in education, they're exactly designed to meet what the customers of today want. Again, first of all, there's this massive demand for something different, a lot of demand for private, customized education. Secondly, there's a desire for flexible time and space. Homeschooling, microschooling provides that. There's a desire for less geographic boundaries and where learning can happen. Microschooling and homeschooling provides a lot less geographic boundaries, both in terms of where schooling can happen, but also where you can place schools. If you think about trying to create new school supply in a marketplace, if you have to create a school of 200, 400, 600 or more students, you can only put those schools in so many places. If we can design schools down to the size of 5 or 10, just think of all the new marketplaces that opens up to where we can put new supply of education. That's another reason why microschooling is exploding. There's significantly less startup cost and risk. If you go to launch a new school, a traditional school, 250, 500 student school, you're talking about a multi-million-dollar investment. You better be sure about the demographic trends in that area. You better be sure that your product is what the market's looking for. You better be committed to being there for 10, 15, 20 years to make that type of an investment. With a microschool or with a homeschool setting, the startup cost is so low that there's such little risk. You can afford to put schools into places you would never put a large traditional school. So a lot less risk and a lot less startup capital. And finally, in a lot of these situations where families are desiring a private education but can't afford maybe $15,000 or $20,000 per year to fund their child's education, the homeschooling and the microschooling sector is far more cost effective. So for all of those reasons, in the next slide you'll see one of the emerging trends in this hyper-customized push in education is an explosion in the homeschooling and microschooling market. As I mentioned, about 30 years ago in most states, homeschooling wasn't even a legal form of educating your children. To today, we now see roughly 1 in 20 children in America are homeschooled. We've gone from almost non-existent to 3 million out of a marketplace of about 56 million kids are now in the homeschooled setting. And again, if you look at that graph, you can see this began way before COVID. It certainly grew during COVID, but it was growing before COVID and has continued to grow post. Microschooling is up to about 1.5 million children as well. So if you put those together, you see this huge surge in that form of education. Besides microschooling and homeschooling, though, there's also been this huge push to unbundle public funding. And I know here in the state of Wisconsin, like many other states, discussions around school choice and charter schooling and policy and legislation, these are big conversations, but I want to encourage you to recognize that that whole conversation is just a symptom of a much bigger shift that's happening out there, right? So the idea of unbundling public funding and allowing parents the ability to use public funding to customize and to personalize their child's education, that's part of this big push to provide more customization in the field of education. So what's been going on with the charter school sector and the school choice sector? I'll start with charter schools. The charter school sector has been exploding. From 2009 through 2019, the sector grew twice as large, so 100% growth in one decade. And again, just like the homeschooling sector, we're up to almost 3 million children out of a total marketplace of about 56 million that are now in the charter school sector. Again, roughly 1 out of 20 children in America are being charter schooled. If you looked at a map of the US, there are 10 states where more than 10% of their children are currently using public funding to go to privately run charter schools across our country. In addition, you have private school choice. Very proud to say that here in the state of Wisconsin, we had the first school choice program. It started here, started in Milwaukee, and it has now grown to be something that's growing across the country. Very much like charter schooling, it has also been growing dramatically. It grew 6 times as large in the last 20 years. It's up to over 650,000 children nationally, and it is poised for significant growth moving forward. The map that is up in front of you right now shows where the best states are to operate in voucher and school choice states. Wisconsin currently is one of the best operational states in the nation. Indiana, Florida, it's a little bit outdated because Arizona's laws have changed recently. They're one of the best states as well. But right now, Wisconsin is leading the way as one of the top school choice states in the nation. But we're going to be overtaken very soon if we don't continue to make advancements in investments in school choice. School choice is probably, in my opinion, the form of personalized, customized education that is the most poised for growth. On this map, you see that back in 2021, there were over 20 states across the country that passed new legislation growing families' ability to use public funding to go to a private school of their choice. It's extremely popular. If you looked at the polling trends, you would see that roughly 70%, and if you break it down by different population groups, it changes, of course, but roughly 70% of the people in America believe that school choice is positive. So this is a topic that has shifted in its popularity dramatically in the last 5 years, but we're seeing it's an extremely positive topic. There's great desire to grow school choice. Right now, we're projecting that we're going to see somewhere between 30 and 50,000 new fully funded seats across our country, where 30 to 50,000 new children per year can use public funding to go into private schools. It would take roughly 100 new schools per year and about 1,500 new teachers per year just to fill this opportunity. All right, that's a ton of data, and I knew it was going to be a ton of data, and I want to step back now from the data and I want to say, okay, so what's the big picture in the US, and then we're going to zoom into Wisconsin. I should have shared in the beginning, I'm a math teacher. I love numbers. I love statistics. so we're doing a flyby right now. I know I'm in a room full of business people. I know you can handle metrics better than most in the field of education, so I feel comfortable here. But I probably love numbers even more than the average person here. So big picture, what's happened? Okay, so zooming out, we had these reports come out in 1980s, early 1990s. We're in trouble. The nation's at risk. Number 1 in the world for something, which is we're the least efficient nation in the world for educational attainment. What happened since 1990 when all those things were happening? And while I said it feels like we're 40 years in, and we could have written some of those outcome reports today, underneath all of this, a lot has actually changed. And in just a minute, I'm going to show you why I think there's actually great reason for hope. But I want to look at the summary report first. So a lot has changed. On the top here, we're looking at 20-year changes. What you notice is now instead of just 2 major ways that people are educated in the US, we now have 6 major ways that people are educated here in the US. So in addition to the traditional public school, and in addition to the traditional private school, we now have the charter school sector emerging, the school choice sector emerging, the micro-school sector emerging, and the homeschool sector emerging. That alone is tremendous change. Then you look at where's the growth happening. And again, this is evidence of what I was talking about. There's this huge push for customized, personalized education. The large district schools and the traditional private schools have basically stayed status quo. There's been a little bit of change up and down, but it's nominal change over the last 20 years. Where the huge growth has been is in the charter school sector. We've seen an increase of 3 million children in the last 20 years. That's 850% growth over 2 decades. In the school choice sector, we've seen a growth of 600 children in the last 20 years. That's 2,000% growth over that time frame. In the micro-school sector, it essentially wasn't there because the resources weren't there to make that happen 20 years ago, but that's grown by 1.5 million children. And the homeschool sector has doubled, up by about 1.5 million children. So there has been a significant shift. If you go back to 1990, what's in green is that there are 8.2 million children out of 56 million who are in forms of education, charter school choice, micro, and homeschooling, that essentially didn't exist back in 1990. That's a significant market shift in the field of education. If you were to take the average cost of educating a child across the U.S., which is about $15,000 or so per student that we're spending to educate children across the United States on average, that's a $100 billion per year market shift in the field of education since 1990. So on the one hand, while the results we're going to see, when you look at the macro results as a whole, we're very disappointed. The numbers are coming out in Wisconsin. We're very disappointed. We should be very disappointed. But I want to encourage that the infrastructure that is creating possibility for change has now emerged and is growing at a very rapid pace. And so we should be asking ourselves, has this also been happening in Wisconsin? And if so, is this actually leading to the potential of better results or not? Are these shifts actually helping us, or are they going to hurt us? So that's where we're going to go next in the presentation. So first, what's going on in Wisconsin? Do we see similar results? The graph that's up there now is looking, and we're going to dive into these numbers a little more closely, so don't worry if you can't see all the small script there. But the big picture is, over the last 20 years, the state of Wisconsin population in K-12 education has shrunk slightly. So that's kind of what you can see there. You can see gradually the total amounts going down. But where are parents going? Are the trends that we see in the national scale happening here in the state of Wisconsin? On the left-hand side of this graph, you're seeing traditional public schools in the state of Wisconsin over the last 20 years. And you're seeing 10-year increment snapshots. The far left bar is 2000, 2001. Then it moves to 2010, 11, and then more recently 2020, 21. And what you see is when you take out students who are moving within the districts for open enrollment, when you take those out and you just look at students that are attending their traditional school district where they live, you see a dramatic decline. That's a little bit different than the national curve, which is pretty much flat, but within Wisconsin you actually see a decline. If you looked at the total population of district schools enrollment in Wisconsin, you wouldn't see that decline, because interestingly enough, on the right-hand side, the public school district open enrollment trends are actually growing. That's that kind of light blue curve that you see second from the top. So the number of children who are still in public schools but are moving to a different public school than where they currently live, that number has actually grown. And what that's enabled is kind of in the big picture, you wouldn't notice a significant decline in public school enrollment, but in the micro, if you looked at children attending their zoned district school, you would see a significant decline. But now what's really interesting is to look at what's going on in the forms of choice in the state of Wisconsin. Do we see growth there? I should back up. In total, yes. It's very clear on the right. When you look at parents expressing some form of choice, whether it's a charter choice, whether it's using vouchers to go to a private school of their choice, whether it's using public school open enrollment, et cetera, you can see in total there's significant trajectory in the state of Wisconsin similar to the national trends where parents are saying, I too want to use opportunities to choose my own education for my kids. Underneath that, you can see what's growing and what's not. Interestingly, in the state of Wisconsin, similar to the traditional private paid tuition-based model of education, that's the top blue line, that's also decreasing. However, the private school enrollment in Wisconsin hasn't decreased very much because the gray line that's up there, that's the voucher enrollment in private schools. So if you look at the total private school enrollment in Wisconsin, the voucher enrollment is growing, the tuition-based, the tuition payers is shrinking, but in total, the private education market has basically stayed the same. You can also see the growth of the charter school enrollment. That's kind of that yellowish, lightish orange graph that's on there, and then the darker orange, that's the homeschooling growth. So again, just like in Wisconsin, the trends that we saw nationally are happening here. If anything, they're a little bit more accelerated here, which again makes sense because we were the first state to pass a school choice law. So these things are sort of, the data points are aligning here. So the big question that we should all be asking is, so what? Is this going to help us or hurt us? Does the mass customization, does giving parents more power to decide the education for their own children, does that help in the macro, or does that actually hurt? Is this going to help workforce down the road, or is this going to hurt workforce down the road? We could spend the next 2 hours looking at graph after graph after graph, and if you want a year from now, if you want me to come back, I'd be happy to do it for you. We could look at many, many graphs that show the many positive effects of giving parents the freedom to choose the education for their own kids. We would see parent satisfaction scores are up. We would say all kinds of behavior issues that we can monitor and that get reported are down. We would see graduation rates are up. We would see that the academic outcomes are up. We would see that enrollment in these forms of choice, we just showed that they are up. We would even see that schools like it. School participation is up. So you would see all kinds of macro trends. I wanted to put two up here that are more recent for you that I think are really compelling statistics. But again, we could go on and on and on about all the positive impact that we're seeing as parents have more and more freedom to customize education for their children. On the far left, very recently, 2022, in the state of Wisconsin, all private schools that accept vouchers take the same state assessment as all district schools. So we have a way of really assessing what are the outcomes for students who are using vouchers to attend a private school versus what are the outcomes of children in their local district. And so there is a way to sort of have a sense of, is this working or not? The outcomes of 2022 were recently released on the state report card. And if you looked at Racine and Milwaukee, which is where the largest percentage of voucher students are in the state, so I wanted to kind of look at where's the biggest density, so we have the largest sample sizes. You don't just have one anecdote somewhere throwing off the statistics. So if we looked at where there's the largest population of district children, the largest population of school choice children, Racine and Milwaukee, and then you ask, were the high schools performing at and above level? So were they meeting and exceeding expectations on the state assessment? In the blue on the left, that's the outcomes for the voucher schools in those cities, and the orange on the right, those are the results for the districts in their cities. We're getting 4 times more high schools are meeting and exceeding the expectations on the state report card with roughly 40% less funding than their local district peers. And I am not here in any way to bash what's happening in districts. That is not my point. What I'm trying to give you is objective data on, is it working to give parents freedom to customize and to find the right match and the best situation for their child's education? Emphatically, that data would say it's not just a small, in the education world, a few percent difference is significant. This is a 4x difference. This is a massive, massive outcome difference in the field of education. Rewinding a little ways into the conversation, one of the favorite stats that I like to track is return on investment. If we look at how much tax dollars are we putting in and how much learning are we getting out, what is the ROI in education, right? So there's huge studies globally on this. I showed you a study earlier that showed the US back in 2003 was #1 in the world for being the worst ROI. So we should be asking ourselves, is customizing education through things like school choice, chartering, homeschooling, et cetera, is that actually moving us in a better direction in terms of taxpayer return on investment? The graph on the right is aiming at that question. Back in 2019, we commissioned a study where a national researcher came in to look at what was happening in the Wisconsin ecosystem, and we looked at how many dollars are being spent, taxpayer dollars being spent in education, and how many points of learning, again on the same exact report card, are coming out of education. And it's simply a very, very simple math equation. Number of points of learning divided by tax dollars equals essentially the ROI. On the left, you see the private schools' return on investment, and on the right, you see the district schools' return on investment. And the punchline is, this is across the whole state now, not just those 2 cities. Statewide, when you look at all students using choice to receive education versus their local peer district, taxpayers are getting a 36% higher return on investment when parents are customizing education than in their local district. 36%. You're business owners, right? If you had a part of your business that's getting 36% higher results, that would influence what you're going to do, the policies you would make, the decisions you would make, your strategic planning. 36% higher. That number goes way higher. If you look specific to Milwaukee and Racine, again, where the largest number of children exist, it's 50% higher in Milwaukee, and it's over 70% higher in the city of Racine. So these are just absolutely remarkable results that we're seeing. There's reasons for hope. The trend lines are heading in that direction, and these systems of education are actually achieving stronger results. All right, I've got to get to so now what? So the good news. The good news is, first of all, these forms, various forms of personalized, customized education are actually getting higher academic results and higher return on investment for taxpayers. That should be very encouraging for us. The second good news is that parents, on average, are choosing the higher performing options for their kids. So when given a choice, there's another question, will parents make sort of a good choice, and will that choice lead to better outcomes? The answer is, in mass, yes. Now, are there situations, or maybe that's a no? Perhaps there's situations. But big picture, we step back and look at the macro, it's a yes. So that's really good news. So the really good news is what's working better is growing, right? That's really good news. What's the challenge? A couple of challenges that, again, we're going to talk about what can WMC and what can you as individuals do to help accelerate this trend to prepare the workforce of tomorrow so that 2035 does come, as we were talking about earlier today. So one of the big challenges is that the policies that govern education in our country are built and stacked on top of 125 years of a system meant for mass production batching. So there's all kinds of policies that assume all kinds of things that fight against where education wants to go. There's a huge amount of work to do, for example, to shift funding is a great example. We're funding the school choice programs as if they're still an experiment. We're funding them as if it's still 1990 and we're testing sort of as a skunk works part of our business. We're testing, is this going to work or not? It's emphatically working. We've got to shift funding and say we need to equally fund all kids regardless of the system because we have evidence that this works over here. So funding is a policy that needs work. Flexibility. We're imposing barriers on schools as if it's the year 1900, and we don't have the flexibility to have access to these emerging marketplaces of resources because of the policy. The policy made sense in 1950 or 1970. It's slowing down the movement of education. And finally, there's policy elements of really the fluidity of enrollment. The fluidity of parents being able to move from one sector to another, from one form of an education to another. It's very, very hard to make those decisions. We need to create a lot more fluidity across the marketplace of education. When that all happens, the next big challenge is going to be the supply side. The supply side isn't there to meet the market demand, and there's a whole other set of challenges on the supply side of education to really scale up once those policy solutions happen to meet the demand that's going to be coming. So some thoughts for each of you as individuals and for WMC as a whole. First, I want to say a huge thank you. This is an area of passion for me. I hope you can tell that. I've been in this field for over 20 years. Recently, WMC joined what's called the Wisconsin Coalition for Educational Freedom, and I can't tell you what an enormous impact that has had to have you at our sides helping to advance this cause across the state of Wisconsin. So to all of your board, to you as members for expressing a desire to move in this direction, we are so grateful that you're part of the Wisconsin Coalition for Educational Freedom. I've mentioned policy is one of the first things we have to work on. That is what that group of people is working on, is how do we change the policies to open up more of these opportunities for more children. Other ideas on what you as individuals or as a collective could do to help accelerate this. Thought leadership is incredibly important. We really need your guidance. As the field of K-12 education is transitioning, we know the workplace is moving just as fast. There's an opportunity here, through your partnership with this coalition, to potentially put together collective thoughts from the business community to provide to hundreds of schools that would happily receive this and listen to what do we need to do to provide graduates who are ready for your workforce. I think it'd be just amazing to create some type of a commission that would provide that type of guidance and feedback, and we could get that out to hundreds of schools who are now very flexible and could adapt quickly to start trying to meet the demands of what you're seeing in the workforce of tomorrow. Third thing I'm mentioning is philanthropy. For those of you for whom charitable giving and philanthropy is part of your world personally or collectively, these new opportunities are creating the ability to blend public funding with private ventures and philanthropic ventures. Thousands of dollars of giving can turn into millions of dollars of impact through really strategic investments philanthropically. It's a whole other conversation, but it's unbelievable what can be done right now with philanthropy because of the ability to have this private-public partnership. And the last thing I want to say in terms of ways to get involved is we desperately need the entrepreneurial and business mindset in the field of education. I'm a lifelong educator. I started off as a teacher. I've been in education my entire life. My family is in business. And I understand the desperate need to be thinking like business people and entrepreneurs at this unique moment in time in our history. And so I'd encourage you, if there is a local board of a school or of one of these advocacy organizations that's on the sheet here, that you would be willing to join and to add your thought leadership, to add your business and entrepreneurial mindset, and help integrate that into the form of education in the future. It's desperately needed. I'd really encourage, as you're thinking about your personal goals over the 2023, 2024, there's never been a better time to get involved in the field of education where you can truly have a significant impact on the trajectory of where this field is going. So as a former math teacher, I had to end with an equation. And I really mean this from the bottom of my heart. First of all, we have unprecedented need. We've fallen behind. We've fallen behind the world. You all know better than I do. We're living in a global economy, and we are not performing well enough to produce the workplace, the workers for the workplace of the future. There's huge need to dramatically and rapidly transform the field of education. The stakes couldn't possibly be higher. You're living in a state where there's unprecedented opportunity. We have the opportunity here in the state of Wisconsin to lead the entire nation forward, to help create the policies and the landscape and the entire educational ecosystem that really does enable this type of flexibility and customization of education that dramatically changes the trajectory of the lives of children and the workforce of tomorrow. The opportunity right here, right now is unbelievable. And when there's unprecedented need and when there's unprecedented opportunity, that means there's unprecedented responsibility. And I really ask for all of you again to step back and consider what is your role? How can you plug in? How can you invest? How can you help all of us as we work at this very unique time in history? If this were 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, we wouldn't have nearly the opportunity that we do right now. This is a unique moment in time in our generation that we haven't seen since all the way back in the early 1900s. We're the business leaders of this generation. We're the ones that are in the seats that you're in this generation. This is our moment, and it's a very unique moment in history. There's never been a better time to get involved and to push on this field of K-12 education and help it move into the future where we can have far better outcomes and a far better workforce for our kids. So thank you for the time, and I'm really grateful for the support that WMC has shown for this movement. Thank you.